Hey everybody. So in my previous lecture, I discussed the readmission of Southern states under the Reconstruction Acts, which we subsequently read, at least a selection of last week in class. And just to summarize, those acts increased the democratic nature of Southern government, right? They guaranteed civil rights. They proclaimed the federal government as the sort of source of protection for those civil rights. And they also proclaimed that citizenship was tied to being born in the nation, right? Prior to the Reconstruction Acts and the 14th Amendment, the idea of citizenship is really murky in the United States, and it's more often associated with one's state, right? One would be, for example, a citizen of Virginia or a citizen of Massachusetts, but one might not think of themselves as a citizen of the United States. And the 14th Amendment really changes that, right? We understand our citizenship as tied to the nation state. And that's one of the really important lasting legacies of these, of this sort of raft of legislation that Congress is passing during the late 1860s, most notably the 14th Amendment. And you'll also remember that one of the mandates of the Reconstruction Acts was that each of the former states that had joined the Confederacy, that had seceded, joined the Confederacy, now had to draft new constitutions before they could be readmitted into the Union. And the federal government, to oversee the creation of those constitutions, establishes 5 military districts. You can see those on the map here. Generals were charged with overseeing election to state conventions where these constitutions would be created. And then the conventions were charged with drafting the constitutions. All men were eligible to vote for these conventions, right? Vote for who their delegate to the convention was going to be, or to participate in the convention themselves, unless they were disfranchised by their participation in the rebellion. So we have either a lot of loyal whites, or we have formerly enslaved people. We also have some Northerners who have moved south who are participating in these conventions. And you'll remember that while states had some control over their constitutions, they had no choice about certain issues, right? They could not ratify the 14th Amendment. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment if Congress was going to accept their constitution and readmit the state. And then Congress gets final oversight over the rest of the Constitution as well, right? It's sort of a check and can say yes or no to the state's readmission. And that is not a new thing necessarily in American history. For territories to become states, for Kansas, for example, prior to the Civil War, to have become a state, or Wisconsin or Michigan, any of these states that joined the Union in the antebellum period, they had to submit a constitution to Congress that would then be subject to congressional oversight. And this is one of the causes of Bleeding Kansas, which we talked about at the beginning of the course, that there were two constitutions submitted, one by a pro-slavery faction, one by an abolitionist faction. So that's not necessarily a new thing, but it's sort of a shock to the system of many Southerners because they had once been states, right? And now they have to go through this process of sort of territorial readmission again. So between 1866 and 1870, all 11 former states were readmitted to the Union. So by 1870, the former Confederacy is obviously dissolved, and the 5 military districts are now 11 states of the Union. So what's changed for these states? I think this is something worth thinking about. What's the difference between 1860 and 1870 in a place like South Carolina or Louisiana, Alabama, etc.? One thing is that there's more public offices. There's just larger state bureaucracies, right? And in this way, these states start to look more like the more developed northern industrial states, a place like New York or Massachusetts. In other words, government's just bigger, right? Government is able to do more, which means it requires more people, which means there's this kind of extensive bureaucracy that there had not been before. All of these states are initially, at least, ruled by Republican coalitions of white and black leaders. Um, Local governments have more control than they historically had. You know, when we think about the slaveholding South, we tend to imagine this bastion of local governance, but that's not necessarily the case, right? Um, Southern politicians were very defensive about the idea of states' rights, but then they were also very hostile to the idea of local control, right? Municipalities, for example, small towns, villages, had relatively little control over their affairs because states governed them quite strictly. So under these new constitutions, localities have a little bit more leeway, a little bit more power to govern themselves. More people could vote, right? That's pretty straightforward development, and they did. We see election participation in some states, and I'll explain this a little bit more in a few minutes, is often over 80%, and even in some cases higher in many southern states, right? So not only do freedmen, formerly enslaved men, have the right to vote, they're using it. Former Confederates are using their right to vote once they get it back under the new constitutions. Everybody's just voting in mass politics is really important in these states, electoral politics, that is. And for the first time, these states offer some kinds of social welfare provisions, right? Public schools, um, some means of caring for the sick or the poor, etc. And those things are going to come under attack in the 1870s as states struggle to find money, as Democrats come back into power in many of these states, and they're very hostile to these provisions. But at least for the moment, in 1870, we see the development of some social welfare state practices throughout the South. So those are the kind of big picture issues on the ground as states are getting readmitted in the late 1860s. Let's move to Washington now for a minute. Andrew Johnson, as you know, was the president when Congress is passing this sort of voluminous and transformative body of legislation between 1866 and 1868. And Johnson, I mentioned this, I think in the last lecture, perhaps the one before, Johnson was a Democrat. He was a former slaveholder. He was extremely hostile to the Republican Party. He was extremely hostile to especially the radical Republicans. And so he vetoes literally everything that Congress sends before him. No president has been more associated with the veto power than Andrew Johnson. He vetoed more bills than every previous president combined until that point. The thing is that Johnson and Republicans have very different conceptions about the war's meaning, about Reconstruction's constitutional significance. Johnson wants a restoration of the Union as it was, with the one exception that there's a 13th Amendment, right? He's come to terms with the fact that slavery is abolished, but that's about all he's come to terms with. He wants to preserve states' rights. He has a dim view of federal power. He very much wants to preserve white supremacy. He's an ardent, outspoken, virulent racist, right? When we read the Edisto Island document a few weeks ago, we see a petition from freed people asking Johnson to restore their claims to land. What we don't see in that document, but what we know, or what we can infer based on what we know about Johnson, is how hostile he would have been to such a petition, right? He did not believe that freed people had any right to the land or had the ability to own land and sort of work it productively. What he said about the idea of freed people having government, freed people having some control over the government, he said, wherever blacks have been left to their own devices, they have shown a tendency to lapse into barbarism. Okay, and he's saying these things very publicly. These aren't sort of private scribblings or something like that. He's giving speeches and saying this. So the idea of bringing freed people into the polity of reimagining what the United States is as a sort of biracial democracy he's very hostile to that. And he's very outspoken in that hostility. On the other side of this question are these radical Republicans that I talked about last time, right? Radical Republicans have a very different idea of what the Civil War has decided and what the future of the United States will look like. This is a country where there's going to be Black citizenship, Black voting rights, Black economic rights, a tearing down of the old Southern planter class, the creation of potentially a more equitable political economy. And they envision a South with infrastructure, public schools, biracial governance. They want a South also. Several folks brought this up very wisely in the discussion forum last week. They want a South with lots and lots of Republican voters, right? And they're trying to cultivate those voters, build their party's base so they can keep winning elections, hold on to power. And crucially, they want control of this whole process. Okay, remember, radical Republicans are in Congress, Johnson's over in the White House, so there's a constitutional power sharing issue here. And the radical Republicans believe wholeheartedly that Congress should have the vast majority of federal power and that it should use that power actively, that they have a very dim view of presidential authority generally, especially when that president is hostile to their agenda. And again, Johnson wants the Union as it was. So we have this very clear conflict, and Johnson's just vetoing everything, and the Republicans are overriding the vetoes quite easily. But over time, the Republicans grow fed up with Johnson. They realize it would be easier if he just weren't there, if someone else were in his position. So they try to remove him through impeachment. Congress had never actually impeached a president before, so this is a first in U.S. history. In February of 1868, the House votes to impeach Johnson. There's 11 articles of impeachment, and 9 are about his violation of 2 laws in particular, and these laws were passed by the Republican Congress to sort of trap Johnson. Okay, the intent of passing these laws was to limit his power, but then also they recognized he'd probably violate the laws and then they could impeach him. Okay, what were those laws? One is called, and you really don't need to know this in the long run, this is like really good trivia information, but I'm just giving you some background information in case you're interested in this. One is called the Tenure of Office Act. And that law proclaimed that the president can't fire a member of his own cabinet. Okay, so it's a somewhat absurd law. Certainly presidents have the power to fire members of their cabinet. The other is called the Commander of the Army Act, and that proclaimed that the president can't issue orders to the Army unless he passes them through an office called the General of the Army, which is essentially today the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In other words, the president isn't quite the commander-in-chief, right? A sort of hobbled commander-in-chief. Again, these laws are passed after Lincoln's death with the intention of limiting Johnson's authority. They flagrantly violated constitutional authority granted to the president. They were deemed unconstitutional later, but this is the sort of basis of the impeachment. Despite the fact that these laws are kind of flagrant violations of presidential authority, he was very close to being removed. And that's never happened in US history, that someone was impeached and convicted by the Senate. He was acquitted in the spring of 1868. The Senate was 1 vote shy of the 2/3 majority necessary to convict. So Johnson ends up serving out his term for the rest of 1868, but he doesn't run for re-election. So he's a lame duck. He's essentially been a lame duck president since 1866 at this point. If you veto every law that Congress passes and they just keep overriding your vetoes, if they've got the majorities to do that, there's very little that Johnson could do other than take tours of the North and hold rallies and shout about his enemies. And those often didn't go well. He was ridiculed by the public. People threw tomatoes at him. It didn't go well for him in the last years of his presidency. Aside from it being the first impeachment in U.S. history, which, this winter, the Johnson impeachment got a lot of attention because we had another impeachment. It's hard to say what the lasting significance of this was. It certainly symbolized the deep hostilities between Johnson and the radical Republicans. It certainly symbolized the radical Republicans' vision of governance, their ideas about power, how they wanted to concentrate authority, um, their ideas that Congress should be the preeminent power in the land and not the president. But other than that, this is a sort of dramatic, but ultimately relatively less than consequential development in the rest of Reconstruction. So Johnson's presidency is effectively finished in the spring of 1868, but there's another election in 1868, right? There's a presidential election that year that Johnson's not participating in, and this is very significant development. The election of 1868 was, by the standards of its own time and the standards since, the most racist, virulent, violent election in U.S. history. The Republicans have spent 2 years creating this new status quo, and they have to protect it. Their candidate is Ulysses S. Grant. His campaign slogan is "Let us have peace," right? And the sort of subtext of "Let us have peace" is let us have peace on the terms of radical Reconstruction. Right? Let's come to peace with the idea that the Union won the war, and the price of that victory has been, or the fruit of that victory has been, I think I should say, this new legal order that's enshrined by the 13th and 14th Amendments at this point, as well as the Reconstruction Acts. Let's have peace on our terms, right? The Democrats' strategy is to attack that status quo. And because so much of the new status quo has to do with Black civil rights, the Democrats' strategy is really an attack on the idea of Black civil rights, Black citizenship. And they make those the central issues of the election. Okay, we won't see politics this racially charged again on a national scale, at least until the 1960s, the early 1970s, the era of George Wallace and Richard Nixon, when it was Democrats, right? There's a sort of reversal of party here, and the Democrats made themselves in the 1960s the party of civil rights, and they lose their foothold in the South forever, and they do that amidst some really intense racist attacks. Okay, so it's going to be 100 years before we see something on this level quite again, but it will never reach, I think, even in the 1960s, not quite reach the violence and the hatred of the 1868 election. The Democrats, their candidate is the former governor of New York, Horatio Seymour. He's running on a ticket of just voiding Reconstruction, handing power back to ex-Confederates. His vice presidential candidate, Franklin Blair, from the border state of Missouri, argues that Republicans had subjected white Southerners to a semi-barbarous race of blacks who are polygamist and destined to subject white women to their unbridled lust, right? The campaign slogan is "Let white men rule America." So this is ferocious, right? They are labeling the Republicans an all-black party, an anti-white party. They're frequently invoking sexual politics to do this, right? When you think about what Franklin Blair said, semi-barbarous race of blacks who are polygamist, right? The men have multiple wives. They're destined to subject white women to their unbridled lust, right? He's going for the jugular here. The election isn't just about voting rights. It's not just about political rights. It's about protecting white women. It's about black men's lust. It's about protecting white men from becoming slaves, right? These are extreme politics, of course. And this, again, this is the major party's platform in a national election in 1868. And the Republicans kind of give it back. They don't obviously adopt racist sloganeering like that, but they do argue that if Democrats win the election, it's as if the war were lost. It would be the same as losing the war. They say it's as if Lee won at Appomattox. And this strategy becomes known as waving the bloody shirt. If you've ever read much about the Gilded Age and Reconstruction generally, right? This period in American history, the 1870s, the 1880s, 1890s, waving the bloody shirt is a really common phrase that you might come across. What it means is calling up the memory of the war in order to advance one's political interests. In 1868, this is really powerful, right? It calls to mind Richard Dana's grasp of war theory that we read last week, a sense that there's still so much to be won or so much to be lost. But over time, waving the bloody shirt becomes sort of an accusation by the late 1870s, 1880s. To be accused of waving the bloody shirt is an insult. It's a suggestion that one's an opportunist, that one is taking advantage of the war's memory to advance their self-interest, and it's a real criticism. So back to the election. Remember, in 1868, the Klan is really fomenting its power and is just coming into its sort of fullest, most active form. And that was in part because of this election, right? The Klan was always a politically organized, politically interested group. And they were effectively the auxiliary of the Democratic Party. So they commit thousands of murders throughout the South in order to stop people from voting, to stop people from organizing. And they also just use physical intimidation to stop others from voting, right? They don't necessarily have to kill someone to keep them from voting. So we see counties throughout the South that in 1866 had really high rates of Republican voting. We see almost no Republican votes in 1868. It's very clear that people were either driven from those counties or they were terrorized into not voting. But that violence, intimidation doesn't necessarily work everywhere, although there is diminished turnout. Grant triumphs in all but 2 of the readmitted states. He would not have won, and those readmitted states, by the way, are Louisiana and Georgia. We do have 3 states that were still not readmitted: Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia. Grant would not have won without freed people's votes. This is an amazing development when you think about this, right? People who were, many of them were still enslaved in the last presidential election in 1864, and none of them could have voted. In 1868, tip the balance and produce a presidential victory. That is an incredibly rapid development, and it shows just how significant that right to vote really is. How meaningful it is for the balance of power. It's not symbolic, right? So, the Grant administration, as we talked a little bit about, and we read this in Foner, there's the Ku Klux Klan Act, there's the Enforcement Acts. All of these things give the federal government power to crush the KKK, and they do that, right? But racial violence doesn't just go away. The Klan is organized, but racial violence can organize in other ways. It doesn't always have to necessarily be organized to be powerful and effective. And that continues through the 1870s. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Ex-Confederates had a lot of resentment over how the war turned out. They had a lot of resentment over the fact that their world had been completely turned upside down, that they've experienced a revolution. There's grief over the destruction of slavery, grief over the outcome of the war. And I don't want to diminish it. That is genuine grief. These are people who have, I would say, an abhorrent ideology, but nonetheless they lose and they suffer in that loss, and that suffering produces political turmoil on the ground. The Democrats attempt to weaken Republican support, right? So the racial violence is always tied to politics, electoral politics. And then just, the sort of basic proliferation of racial hatred that characterized life in the South, right? These are old hatreds and animosities and ideas of inferiority and superiority, and they don't just go away when the federal government crushes the Klan. So most fundamental to all of this, however, I think most historians would agree with this. There's a lot of causes for racial violence, but the most basic cause, and the cause that you really can't ignore, is an economic cause. Whites need blacks to remain landless. They need them to become dependent agricultural workers as they had been under the old regime. This is the primary goal throughout Reconstruction, to limit blacks' capital, keep them as close to the land, as close to slavery, frankly, as possible. And for their part, resisting in the struggle to make them dependent, formerly enslaved people want to advance their own economic interests, right? They want to promote their own human capital. They want an education. They need literacy. They need skills, marketable skills, so they can support themselves. They also want physical, economic capital, land, tools, money, all the things that we've been talking about. And there are some institutions set up to help them do that, to help them achieve these things. Freedmen schools, of course, are all through the South, and we do see literacy rates increasing. There are only about 5% of formerly enslaved people can read in 1870, and that number goes up to about 15% in that decade. It's about 25% by the turn of the century. It's very low, but compared with where it had been in the 1860s, it's relatively high. Another institution is the Freedmen's Bank. Okay, so there's a bank that's specifically chartered to nurture freed people's investments and to protect their deposits. And with more government support, the Freedmen's Bank may have been successful. It was chartered in 1865, but it collapses amid mismanagement. In 1874, the managers of the bank had invested heavily. These were sort of not very secure investments, very volatile investments that ended up blowing up in their faces, and they ended up losing all of the money that had been deposited in the bank. Is actually a real terrible tragedy when you think about how little freed people had, and then they put what little they have into this bank, and then the bank managers lose it. It's really a devastating story. So blacks really throughout the 1870s have very little access to financial capital, to real estate. It's nearly impossible to get loans. And there's a real struggle to survive throughout the 1870s. One of the outcomes of this is the proliferation of sharecropping, and I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Making matters worse and sort of precipitating and also perhaps causing the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank is the fact that there's a depression. The Panic of 1873 sets off a depression, the worst economic crisis in US history prior to the Great Depression. The Reconstruction South is especially vulnerable to this economic collapse, and it's a global economic collapse, right? There's very limited investment in the South, and what investment existed was frequently unstable or shaky. So what investments are already there, they begin to collapse. People can't pay back debts, and loans go unserviced, and so a lot of projects that are underway in 1873 just halt or go bankrupt. But also really important investment from abroad, from New York or from Baltimore or Boston, but also from Europe. People who would potentially invest in the South, they're not doing it anymore. So these are really hard times that fall on the South. And what we see in the South between this depression in 1873 and the next one in 1933, in those 60 years, is we see many communities that never really come out of this age of depression. We see craters in commodity prices, cash crop commodity markets. We see continued failure of infrastructural development, or we see bankruptcy. And so hard times really haunt the post-Civil War South for several generations to come. Okay. Another issue here, another development, is that the Panic of 1873 obviously affects the North as well. And so what we see in the later 1870s and throughout the rest of the 19th century is that the old issues of the Civil War era, right, concern about freed people's welfare, concern about the state of these governments, these newly reconstructed governments, those were once major political issues. Those are the biggest issues in the election of 1868. They really begin to recede in the North. And Northerners, especially Northern whites, have less and less concern over the South. And the Panic of 1873 really accelerates this growing disinterest or uninterest. In the place of freed people's welfare, we see currency, tariffs, unemployment, subsidies, labor organizing, labor militancy. These are the big issues, right? The price of grain is a major political issue in the North by 1875. Freed people's welfare, not nearly as much. So we see from 1868 to the Panic of 1873, a kind of waning of radicalism. Here's a good image from the Panic. Old radicals are dying, they're leaving office. Party leaders are turning their attention to other issues. The voting public is exhausted by Reconstruction. As one very prominent editor, Horace Greeley, he was once a Republican, once a very famous abolitionist. He says in 1870, "Let us have done with Reconstruction. The country is tired and sick of it. Let us have peace." Right? And as Heather Cox Richardson has pointed out, and Eric Foner adopted this line of argumentation in that piece we read, there's a growing association in the North of the welfare of Black workers in the South with these increasingly vocal and radical labor movements in the North, who are adopting socialist and communist principles. And so a lot of Northern capitalists, a lot of the people who have political and economic power in the North, they grow less and less interested in supporting freed people because they begin to make that association, right? If we support freed people in the South, are we going to have to respond to these industrial workers who are on strike in New York or in Cincinnati or wherever? So Reconstruction, right, it's far from dead in the early 1870s, but it's crumbling. It's beginning to fall apart. The political will is not there. The finances are not there. And into this sort of vortex of factors that are really challenging Reconstruction comes this renewed, very powerful, often very violent white supremacist counter-revolution against Republican governments in southern states. And the Democratic Party begins taking power back state by state by state throughout the South in the 1870s. And this is a process that's known as redemption. Okay, its agents, the people who are responsible for it, call themselves redeemers. Their children and grandchildren would remember them as such, would remember them as the redeemers. And redemption, as you may know, it means the action of saving from sin, right? A redeemer is someone like Christ who saves or absolves others of their sins. So when historians refer to this process as redemption, they're accepting or they're adopting the Democrats, the white supremacists sort of term for themselves. We are the ones who saved these corrupted Black governments, and we restored them to their rightful rulers, which is the Democratic Party. Okay. Redemption is about a 7-year process from about 1870, once the states are readmitted, to 1877, which is when federal troops are finally removed from the South. And Reconstruction really does officially kind of end. So like dominoes falling over those 7 years, Democrats take back one state legislature after another, and they begin hacking away at Black civil rights. I think the most notable episode, certainly the most horrific episode of redemption, occurs in Louisiana in 1873. This was the Colfax Massacre. It exemplifies the severity of racial violence throughout redemption. The origins of this massacre are in the 1872 presidential election, another very contested and bitter election. In Louisiana, the outcome is contested, and so two governments claim legitimacy. So you have, this is a really profound constitutional crisis. Two competing governments say they're the ones who won. One is called the Fusion Ticket, which is sort of a white supremacist coalition. It's Democrats, but it's also old Whigs and old slaveholders who don't identify with the Democrats. And then the Republicans, which is the sort of loyal white and black coalition all over the state. And remember I said a few minutes ago, Reconstruction governments had more offices. They had these more complex bureaucracies. Well, what that means is that there's a lot of offices that need someone in control of them. And every one of those little offices becomes a site of a contest between this Fusion Ticket and the Republicans. Okay, so this is all over the state. There's all kinds of conflicts going on, and there's white formation of what's called the White League, which is a paramilitary group very similar to the Klan. In the midst of this tension, formerly enslaved people in Grant Parish, it's kind of right in the middle of the state, in a very, very bountiful agricultural region, a region with a long history of slavery, cash crop production, sugarcane, etc. They begin congregating in the town of Colfax. This is sort of a safe haven. It had long been a site of black settlement. Their numbers are better there. There's safety to be had there. They amass weapons, they build trenches, and they're really just trying to create a defensive posture, knowing they're going to be attacked. And on April 13th, there's a huge mob of former Klan members and Confederate soldiers armed with a cannon. They have a mass of arms. They attack Colfax. Blacks retreat into the county courthouse. The mob burns the building with all of them inside. And those who try to flee are just murdered when they leave the building. Numbers range from 80 to 150 blacks are murdered that day. Almost all of them are killed execution style. Their bodies are mutilated. Their bodies have been just left out for weeks on end. As you can see by this sign, the event was sort of celebrated in the White South afterwards. It's called a riot. A riot is a very strategic word. A massacre implies that one group took advantage of another with a power imbalance and simply murdered them. A riot would suggest that there was social unrest and it just sort of developed, right? And no one's necessarily to blame. And as you can see by the marker here, it says that the event marked the end of misrule in the South. Okay, so the Fusion Ticket and the Democrats seized power afterwards. And freed people's power in Louisiana begins to decline pretty rapidly afterwards, which in the South of the turn of the century, the Jim Crow South, was something to be celebrated. The Colfax Massacre was a national sensation. It got a lot of attention in the northern media, but its most lasting legacy outside of Louisiana is a court case that follows it. So a number of members of the White League are brought up on charges. Only 3 of them were ever convicted. They're convicted in a federal court. One of the charges against them that they're convicted on is that they violated the civil rights of their victims. Okay. And the case that comes out of this and eventually reaches the Supreme Court is called United States versus Cruikshank. It's heard in 1875 and decided in 76. And the court takes up the appeals of one of the White League's leaders, a guy named William Cruikshank. So the case becomes a test of the federal government's ability to protect Black civil rights in the South. Does the federal government actually have that kind of jurisdiction? Is it possible to enforce all of those new laws from early in congressional Reconstruction, especially the 14th Amendment? Now the court's heavily Republican. Nearly every justice has been nominated by Lincoln or Grant. And you'd think that they're going to defend a very expansive reading of the 14th Amendment. Its promises of due process and equal protection are the kind of bedrock of Reconstruction law, but they don't. And instead, the court declares that the 14th Amendment applies only to the actions of states, not the actions of individuals. So what does that mean? It means that if the state constitution says an American citizen can't vote, that is unconstitutional. But if a man murders another man to keep him from voting, that's a state issue, and the federal government has no right to intervene, right? And if the state is in control of a white supremacist party, such action is probably not going to be prosecuted. In fact, it's definitely not going to be prosecuted, right? So what this ends up doing is giving groups like the White League, terrorist organizations like this, a lot more power to attack Black people for trying to vote or trying to organize politically, okay? And it also declares that the federal government has no ability to intervene in this issue. So crucially, what this signifies is that the federal government is exiting Reconstruction. This is 1876. The federal government, beset by issues in the West, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this lecture, beset by financial crises, and with a growing disinterest among Northern white voters, and now the Supreme Court backing away from enforcement of all of these new laws, the federal government's walking away, okay? Terror, which had been held back by federal intervention for the last decade, is essentially given a green light. And what we're gonna see is 2 decades of declining Black political power, Black political rights, leading up to the creation of the Jim Crow regimes in the 1890s. Okay, and this new Jim Crow era of segregation is going to emerge out of this. So that's a lot about race and Reconstruction. Okay, and I think it can often seem, and it makes sense if it seems this way to you, because you read Foner, you read the primary sources, you listen to me lecture, as if race is the only issue on the table during Reconstruction, particularly in the South. And if there's one thing you're going to walk away with, that should probably be it, right? That is the central issue, and that's one of the major lasting legacies of Reconstruction, is this dynamic of racial oppression and violence in the Reconstruction South that leads us up into the Jim Crow era. And of course, the war was about slavery. And so these are the legacies of slavery. So if there's one thing you're taking away, that should be it. But I also want to remind you that it's not the only story, right? Or the story of race in the Reconstruction South is not a simple one. It can be, when you drill down into local politics in individual states, an incredibly complex one, and often one that would surprise you. And this is because, among other things, whites were not a uniform group during Reconstruction. I know that I've often, for the sake of brevity and for the sake of sort of simplicity, tried to use terms like, and then whites organized, things like that throughout this lecture. But if we had all day, we could talk about all the differences in white politics that exist within white politics in the Reconstruction South. If there's one shared idea, it's an idea of white supremacy. But what that means on the ground to individual people can be quite different. And some people are willing to make peace with Blacks' participation in politics where others are not. Um, Not all Southern whites saw an advantage or a real use in political violence or terrorism, or even disenfranchisement, right? There were a number of Southern whites who saw some real value in having this new block of Black voters, right? For example, during redemption, as Democrats take power throughout the South, not all states eviscerated Black rights immediately, and some didn't do it quickly at all. Some, it took a couple of decades. Um, Georgia and South Carolina did so immediately, and we see voting participation in those states decline. Only about 40% of technically eligible voters participated in elections during the 1870s, which suggests that Black voters were completely blocked from exercising their civil rights. But elsewhere, in North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, Florida, also the border states, but quasi-southern states of West Virginia and Kentucky, Black civil rights are relatively untouched compared to elsewhere. Black men continue voting en masse until the 1890s in Jim Crow. In Virginia, Blacks are essential to the coalition that rules the state up into the early 1880s, and they continue to have a role even when Democrats truly take power in the 1880s. In other words, for all of the violence and terrorism that defines Reconstruction, and there is a lot of it, and it is horrific, and it is central to the story, many Southern whites also just wanted to work within the new system, right? They wanted to build alliances with Black voters that could help them achieve their own goals. They found they required Black support to advance their own self-interests. And this last point is really important. The Democrats were a party of white supremacy, but they were a deeply divided party, and they were a relatively small party. They couldn't, as one historian's put it, contain all the ambitions of all the white men who sought political rewards and appointments, right? And what would those disappointed men go and do who felt left out from the new ruling party? They would build alliances elsewhere. They would find ways to achieve their ambitions elsewhere. And that's what happens. And what does that do for Black voters? It gives them an opportunity. If we look away from issues outside of elections and outside especially of voting rights, and we just look at this kind of mundane, nitty-gritty, really kind of boring, technical, but kind of important daily issues of politics, we see a dynamic that's quite different than what we've come to expect when we think about Reconstruction, right? If we're talking about like what incentives states should offer to businesses to come and do work in their state or to set up shop in their state, if we look at how states would navigate the issue of bankruptcy when those businesses ended up failing, right? These kinds of things that are really significant and highly contested, but also somewhat easily overlooked. We start to see that whites disagree a lot over these issues, and that Blacks are able to carve out political influence and political opportunity to break stalemates and to achieve some lasting power. And they're doing that throughout the 1870s and 80s in much of the South. Okay, so it's a more surprising and complex story. This is happening amidst the terrorism, right? I think this is one of the reasons why Reconstruction can be overlooked, is that it sort of boggles the mind. And that path from Reconstruction in the 1870s to Jim Crow and segregation in the 1890s is a very weird and winding and often surprising one. It's not as even or clean as maybe a lot of textbooks would make it seem. There's even conservative white supremacists, like old slaveholders who have a lot of power, big time secessionists, right? Who discourage violence against Blacks, right? Who are vehemently opposed to white terrorism. And they do that because formerly enslaved people, right? Freed people are the bedrock of Southern labor. And you can't go terrorizing the labor force and expect to have a good year in cotton or sugar or tobacco or what have you. Um, so a lot of these arch conservative secessionists end up making peace with some degree of black political power if it means that work is going to be a little bit more stable, that the labor base is going to be a little bit more stable and protected. So there's a lot of surprises in Reconstruction, and it can be a sort of maddeningly complex process. Um, let's quickly sum up what some of the things that Reconstruction is, and some of these are contradictory. It's a moment of significant political and more moderate but still important economic progress for African Americans. It just is. Okay, despite the horrors, the violence, the terror, the disenfranchisement, um, there is progress to be seen on the ground, and this is not merely the reinstitution of slavery. It's the creation of something new and different, something that's unequal, something that's frankly often bad, really bad, but also there is progress amidst that. It's a moment of advancing federal power. And then, for reasons I'm going to discuss in a moment, it's a retreat of federal power and an acceptance of Southern states' autonomy. Um, it's a moment of extreme white violence and terrorism, and it's a moment when many white conservatives and many important Democrats make peace with the end of slavery, and some blacks gain economic and political influence and stability. Okay, it's all of those things at once, and I think no institution better represents the mixed and odd legacies of Reconstruction better than sharecropping. Sharecropping, nobody in 1865 was sitting on their hands and saying, I think a good replacement for slavery would be sharecropping, right? It's not an economic situation that's handed down from above. It's not really designed by anybody in particular. Instead, it's the best bad option for just about everybody involved, okay? Sharecropping is when a tenant farmer, and sharecroppers were white and black, works on someone else's land, and rather than paying rent in cash, devotes a portion of their crop for the year to their landlord, as well as a portion to someone who's called a furnishing merchant. Sometimes landlords and furnishing merchants, the same person. That's basically like, if you're in Missoula, it would be like, oh geez, I don't know, Home Depot or the MUD, Missoula Urban, what is it, Missoula Urban Design Development, that group over on Russell. They loan you out the tools to do the work, and they loan you out the seed, and they loan you out the fertilizer, and then you give them a portion of the crop too, and then you keep a portion of the crop, right? Sharecropping exists as a compromise for a society where there's no available credit. No one's getting loans. There's just no money to be had, and so this is the situation that people agree to. It offers for freed people a degree of autonomy. Okay, they like sharecropping because they're not directly working for someone else, right? Even though they're on somebody else's land, they have some power over their daily regimen and routine, some power. And they also have a chance to own and sell some of the crop. It offers landlords a constant source of agricultural labor so that they can make their land as profitable as possible, which is really hard in an age of declining commodity prices and cratering economic prospects. It offers furnishing merchants. They're the ones who win out the most, right? If you own that local store and you can loan out everything from a rake to fertilizer to people all over the county, you're going to be the one who really profits, and they certainly are the ones who do. So furnishing merchants not only are able to amass some degree of wealth because they're gathering in crops from all over the place, They also now have some power and some control over local labor practices. So they do develop some significant influence. For a lot of people, it becomes a dead end, right? Despite there being some advantages for everybody, for many, it doesn't work out, right? Many sharecroppers realize that they're not ever going to amass enough capital from selling their crops to save and buy their own land. Okay, they're never going to make enough to get out of the place that they live, and they're sort of stuck. And again, this is black sharecroppers and white sharecroppers find themselves in these situations. But again, it's the best bad option. Both sides do accept it. And it lasts more or less for the next century in much of the South. Let's finish up by moving far away from the sharecropping South and talk about the West. As I've mentioned several times this semester, and we're going to talk more about this in the ensuing weeks, the West is essential to understanding the Civil War. Right? We go back to week 1, we're talking about the causes of the war, and we're talking about the pro-slavery factions and the free labor factions in antebellum America contesting control of the West. Are these going to be slave or free territories? And it remained, of course, the big prize of the war as well. You'll remember that even in the midst of the war, the Lincoln administration maintains a very aggressive federal Indian policy, illustrated by the mass execution of the Dakota in 1862 in Minnesota. And despite the obvious significance of the West, I think we often sort of break into 2 separate timelines of the Civil War era, do 2 separate tracks, right? We have the South in Reconstruction and the creation of this new plantation economy and sharecropping economy. And then we have the sort of Old West that's glorified and romanticized by, say, Western films, right? But these are happening at the same time. These developments are occurring at the same time in the same moment. And they're not necessarily separate tracks, although they can seem like that, right? I think sometimes we think Reconstruction is happening in the South and something else is happening in the West, and they're just different stories. They need different chapters in every book, and they don't have much to say about one another. Right, so we've got this story of white settlement, Indian wars, the construction of reservations, the making of modern federal Indian policy, the creation of new extractive industries, the creation of massive stockyards and mines and railroads, etc. Chinese labor. Those stories sort of seem separated out from Reconstruction. But let's think about this for a second. Think about Montana, for example, in the 1870s. Montana is a significant place in the 1870s. It's the site of the Marias Massacre in the year 1870. Obviously, the Battle of Little Bighorn, one of the most famous events of the decade in 1876, the Nez Perce War in 1877. All of those events overlap with everything I've been talking about in this lecture so far. The rise and fall of radical Reconstruction, the Colfax Massacre, redemption. So what do we do with that? Right, this is, I think, one of the most important questions we can ask now in US history when we're talking about the 19th century. How do we bridge these 2 tracks? How are developments in Montana related to those in Louisiana? What does emancipation and then the advancement of Black civil rights have to do at all with wars of extermination and genocide that are happening at the same time? There's a few different ways, I think, to answer that question. One is from an economic perspective. right? All of this is driven by Northern. You could say all of this is driven by Northern capital. It's driven by a handful of families in New York and Boston who want to shift the American economy away from its emphasis on cotton and tobacco, et cetera, and towards industrialization of the entire continent, right? So these folks continue to invest in the South through railroads and through plantations, et cetera. But they're much more interested in heavily investing in new areas, in the construction of the transcontinental railroads, in new agricultural development in the far west, places like California or Nebraska or the Dakotas, in the construction of mines, in the construction of stockyards, etc. And that's a convincing answer, right? If you, as they say, follow the money, you can start to see a lot of connections in what's happening in the South and the West. Another, and there are these new, this is obviously a caricature, but these new powerful capitalists of the late 19th century, and one of the reasons the age is called the Gilded Age. Okay, gilding is a gold plating over something that is not truly gold. Mark Twain came up with that term as a sort of criticism, right? To say, yeah, on the outside, this is an era where it looks like a lot of people are getting really wealthy and really powerful and things are great. But if you look on the inside, it's really rotten. Okay. Another answer is more political, right? Another way of connecting these different tracks is to think in terms of politics and think in terms of what's happening in Washington. And what we could do here is we could say the upheaval in the West and the intense federal focus on the West as well as on the South in the 1860s and 1870s are just different manifestations of a single major process, and that is the creation of a new imperial nation state that is called the United States of America, right? It shares its name and it shares many of its founding creeds with the nation that was born in the 1780s in the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia, but is different too, right? Because it is dedicated to crushing rebellions against its authority, whether those rebellions are launched by slaveholders in South Carolina or by the Dakota in Minnesota. It's dedicated to imposing universal labor relations, putatively free labor relations. It's dedicated to imposing certain conceptions of land use, private property ownership, etc. And from this perspective, we can start to see, oh, emancipation and the Indian Wars are two sides of a coin, right? Slavery and Native peoples' communal organizations, their approach to land use and labor organization that's different than norms in the United States, in the northern United States, those are challenges to the power of the federal government. Those are anathema to northern white Protestant ideals. And so when we have this strictly northern white party, the Republicans, northern party, not necessarily white party, the Republicans come to power, they have to fight rebellions on those two fronts. And as they put those rebellions down, they have to consolidate their power and assert the federal government's domination over the entire continent. And that's exactly what they do from the Civil War to the Indian Wars and going forward. So that's just something for you to think about, for you to try and begin building that connection between the story of the South and the story of the West. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Looking forward to discussing all of this with you on the forum. Talk to you all soon. Thanks.